Good morning. This is Mrs. Allison, and today what we are going to do is we are going to work on 4 representations. So we're going to take what we've learned about slope and about graphing the equation of a line, and the tables that we've looked at with our expressions at the first unit, and we're going to combine them all together and look at how they all work together to build one problem, and how we can use those to answer any algebraic question. So if I'm given just a table, how do I answer the question? If I'm given just a graph, how do I answer the question? And we want to be able to use all 4 of these representations to help us solve different problems in algebra. So 4 representations, they are a situation, story. Okay, the 4 representations are a situation or story, a table, a graph, and an equation. It doesn't mean we have to go in that order. Those are just the 4 representations. For example, we will start with some problems where we're given just an equation and use it to graph, to write a table, and to make up a story. Sometimes we're given a table and we can use it to work backwards to get a graph and an equation and a situation or a story. So all 4 of these representations need to work together to give us the same results. So let's look at what this looks like. Okay, here we are. In this particular situation, we have a tile pattern. We've seen some of these before, dealing with toothpicks or various shapes. And each of these tile patterns is labeled. So for example, this first one's figure 1, the next one's figure 2, the next one's figure 3. So anytime we're given a tile pattern or a story, what would be a good thing to do would be to come up with either the next figure in the story or one before it, if we can go backwards. So let's think about what would happen if we were to look at figure 4, and then also what would happen if we were to look at figure 0. What would they look like? What I would like you to do is pause the video and talk to the people you're working with about what those figures might look like. What is your prediction? When you're ready, hit play again. Okay, so hopefully you had a chance to think about what these figures might look like. And if I were to notice a pattern that's happening, what I see is that each time, every time, each time, remember it's a repeated multiplication, I'm adding 2 tiles, one at the beginning and the end of this figure. So if I were to make a prediction about what this might look like, for figure 4, we have that tile in the center, and then I would predict that up top, rather than having 3 tiles, I would have 4 tiles down below, and then 4 tiles on the bottom here. Mine aren't drawn to scale. And then for figure 0, what do you think for figure 0? I'm thinking just that center box, because I'd have no tiles across the top. So I have figure 0, figure 4. We notice that as we're talking through this, we might say each time I'm adding 2 tiles. Okay, let's move on. Now let's look at this table, and I've included on my diagram the pictures. You should still have it, it's all on that one page. So let's think about what controls what, because when we make a table of values, we need to have 2 parts. We need to have a control variable, and we need to have the dependent variable. So ask yourself, does the figure number control how many tiles? Or does how many tiles control the figure number? Talk to your neighbors, see what you come up with. I think that the figure number controls how many tiles. So I'm going to put my figure number over here on the left-hand side of my table, and I'm going to put the number of tiles on the right-hand side of the table. Sorry, I'm writing on an iPad, so with my finger. Not always that great. I'm actually going to include the figure number before the one I'm given. So I'm going to go backwards to 0, because that'll help me look at my equation in a minute. And then I'm going to go forwards, and I'm just going to start building my pattern. And I could keep going higher, 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 and we'll look at a pattern in just a moment that goes higher. Now with your group members, I would like you to fill out the table of values. And what you're going to do is you're going to put the number of tiles in. So for example, figure 0 we said had 1 tile. Figure 1 had 3. Figure 2 had 5. And go ahead and fill out the table of values. And we're actually going to continue to extend that table of values. So if you want to go up to about as many values, x values, figure numbers as there are on the graph, that would be great. It may seem tedious, but I'll show you why we're doing this in a future slide. So hit pause and then come back when your table of values is done. All right, here we go. I have completed my table of values. I could have gone one more to 18, but 18 went off my graph for the y, so I stopped there at 17, figure number and number of squares 35. So I have filled out my table of values. It looks a little bit prettier now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to graph from my table of values. I'm going to make a scatter plot. Now, what I'm going to tell you about this is you could certainly write your equation first. You could have graphed before you made your table of values. It doesn't need to go in this order. This is just the order I happen to choose to go in for this particular project. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to graph my table of values. And I'm just going to plot points and then connect them with a line. Hopefully what we'll see is this does make a nice straight line. So figure 0, I'm going to label my axes. So I know that my x-axis is my figure number. And I know my y-axis is the number of squares or number of tiles. Okay, so I've labeled my axes so I know any reader could pick up my graph and know what they're looking at. So then I'm just going to start plotting points. So 0 is at 1. My dots are going to be a little bit off. 1 is going to be at 3. 2 is going to be at 5. 4 is going to be at 7. Oops, I probably should say 3. 3 is going to be at 7. 4 is going to be at 9. And I'm going to keep going up and I'm going to graph all of these points and then I'm going to connect them with a nice smooth line, straight line. So take a minute and I would like you to hit pause and complete the graph. Okay, hopefully you have a graph done and it looks like this graph that I have here drawn in. Everybody have a graph that looks something like that? Okay, so we have the table of values, it's complete. We have a graph, it's complete. We have the story, it's complete. What we're working on now is the equation. And when I go and write an equation, we need to look at several things. One, my equation needs to match what my table says. My equation needs to match what my graph has graphed. And my equation needs to fit the story problem. So when we were talking about what pattern should come next, what tile should come next, what had happened in this pattern, hopefully what you said to yourself was, I added 2 tiles every time, or I added 2 squares every time. And remember, we talked about that every time, the per, the every, the each, is that repeated repeated addition, which means multiplication. So I know when I go to write my equation here, this equation, what I have so far is y equals 2x because I added 2 each time, so 2 times x. So 2 becomes my slope. And let's think about it this way. Remember when we talked about explaining the slope in terms of the problem? And we would say here with the slope being 2 or 2 over 1, if we want to picture it as 2 over 1, I am adding 2 tiles or squares each time. Or each one figure number, I could say, might be better since we said that goes with the y value. So each one figure number. Does that fit the pattern that we saw when we looked at our story? Does that fit what it says on the graph? Does it fit what it says on the table? So let's look at our table for a second. If I went and looked at my table, between here I'm going up 2. Between here I'm going up 1. Even if I skip and I go from 5 to 11, I'm going up 6. and this is going up 3. And therefore, I'm still going up 2 over 1. Up 2 squares. I put tiles. Let's erase that. Oh, I can't erase it at this point. 2 squares instead. Let's call it squares. For each one figure number would be a better way to describe that. That fits. Now, here's the problem. I can't just say y equals 2x. Why? Well, because if I plug in 0, 2 times 0 doesn't give me 1. And if I plug in 1, 2 times 1 doesn't give me 3. Well, let's use some clues that we have in our graph. Look at our graph. What point does it hit at? What is this point called? Right, that's called the y-intercept. So I know that that y-intercept needs to be a part of my equation. So y equals 2x plus 1 would be my equation. Please, when you're writing an equation based on the 4 representations, make sure that it all matches. So let's look at that. Okay, so if I go through and look at my equation, and I want to pick any point that I've gotten in here. So I know that if I plug in 3, according to my table of values, I should get 7. I have 7 tiles in figure 3 on my diagram. And on here, figure 3 takes me up to 7. So if I want to just check my work, and we'll just check it real quick. If I check my work and I plug in 3, does y equals 2 times 3 plus 1 give me the 7 that I'm looking for so that they all match? And the answer is yes. So I know that my equation, y equals 2 or 2 over 1, x plus 1, is the equation. So right here on this page, you can see 4 representations. I have my figures, my situation, my story. Sometimes these could actually be words. I have my table, I have my graph, and I have my equation. Those are my 4 representations. Okay, that's all fine and great. So let's move on to what happens when I actually need to use these 4 representations to answer questions. Okay, here we go. The directions state to clearly show, using the table, the equation, and the graph, how to answer the following questions. So the first question we're going to look at is, how many tiles are in figure 7? Okay, I want to show you how we can use each of these 3 representations to answer this one question. That way, if you're taking a test, a standardized test of some sort, and all they give you is a table of values, where is it that we can find the answer to the question? If all I have is an equation, where can I find the answer to the question? If all I have is a graph, where can I find the answer to the question? Okay, so your graph would be labeled maybe a little bit different because remember we labeled our axes. So mine down here, I'm out of room, says figure number here and number of squares or tiles. That's number of tiles for the y. Oopsies, tiles doesn't have a y. Number of tiles for the y. Okay, so let's answer this question. I am going to figure out how many tiles are in figure 7. Okay, so let's start with the table. With the table, I need to figure out figure 7. Well, I'm going to start in the column that says figure number, and I'm going to go down to 7. And according to this, in the 7th figure, there are 15 squares or 15 tiles. Okay, I've just answered the question. I've showed my teacher, my reader, whoever's looking at this, that I know where the answer is on my table of values. So circle it. Circle around it and tell yourself that you know how many tiles. According to this table, there are 15 tiles in figure 7. Okay, so let's look at on the graph. All right, from the graph, what we're going to see is we are going to figure out which axis represents our figure numbers. And we know that the y represents the number of tiles and the x represents the figure numbers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to trace over to where I see figure 7. And then what I'm going to do is I am going to, here's figure 7, I'm going to trace up visually. I do want you to graph it on there. I want you to draw it just how I'm doing it. Figure 7, I'm going up and I see where it hits the graph. Where it hits the graph is what my answer is. So I'm going to take this over to figure out what the y value is. And notice that it says that the y value is 15. So at 7 tiles, it's 15. I'm sorry, figure number 7 is 15 tiles. Notice it said the same thing in the table. Your table and your graph have to say the same thing. If they don't match, then one of your representations is off, and it'd be important to figure out which one. Okay, now let's go and use the equation. And so on the equation, y still represents the number of tiles, which is what I'm trying to solve for. And x represents the figure number. So what do you think I'm going to do? I am going to take figure number 7, which is what I'm trying to find. Figure number 7, we know figure represents the x, and I'm going to plug 7 in for x in the equation. So in my equation, instead of plugging in x, I'm going to plug in 7 because that represents the figure number. And then I'm going to do my math, and I get y equals 14 plus 1, which gives me y equals 15. Do you notice how the table matches the answer we got from the equation, matches the graph? And if I were to continue the pattern of graphing my situation or my story with those tiles, what I would see is in figure number 7, I should have 15 total tiles. I'd have 7 on the bottom, 7 on the top, and then that one square in the middle. So this is how we clearly show, using the table, we've circled it, using the equation, we've plugged in and shown our work, and using the graph, we've started at figure 7 and we've shown where it crosses my graph to answer that one question. So when I ask you to do these problems and I ask you to clearly show, this is what I'm looking for, okay? But this is how you can solve any problem using any one of the representations. So let's look at a slightly different question. All right, here's the last question. What figure number has 33 tiles or squares? So at this time, I'm asking what figure has 33 tiles? So I'm looking for what x has 33y. So what I would like you to do is with your neighbors or the people you're working on this video with, pause the video and see if you can answer this question using the table, using the equation, using the graph. Okay, hopefully we all have answers using the table, the equation, and the graph, and I'm just going to walk you through. Hopefully all 3 of those answers matched. So we are trying to figure out what figure number has 33 tiles. That's my main question. And what I'm going to do is I am going to start by going to where the 33 tiles is on my table of values. This is why it's important to continue your table of values. Here is the number of squares, and here I see 33 tiles. So if I were to show my reader I know where my answer is, I would circle where 33 tiles is, and it tells me figure number 16 is what I'm looking for. Okay, let's see if that translates to my graph. Remember, the y-axis, yours is labeled, mine is not. Remember that the y-axis represents the number of tiles or the number of squares, and the x-axis is the figure number. And by writing that right there, I'm going to be right in the way. So let's erase the figure number. Here we go. So I am going to find 33. Here's 33 tiles. And I'm going to do the same thing in reverse. This time I'm going from the y-axis over to my graph. And then here's where the answer is. So I'm going to trace that down to figure out what value it is. My numbers are a little squished in there. And you can see that at 33 tiles, I'm at figure 16. Well, Does that match what I found on my table? So far, yes. My table and my graph match. So now let's try it with the equation. Which variable am I plugging in for, and which one am I trying to find? All right, if I have 33 tiles, I know that represents the y. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug in 33 for the y, and I'm going to work backwards to figure out what my x is. So we're going to subtract 1. We get 32 equals 2x, and I'm going to divide by 2, and I get x equals 16. So what it shows me is that 16 is the figure number, 16 is the figure number, 16 is the figure number. You'll notice I did not plug 16 into the equation. I don't know 16. If I didn't have my table, if I didn't have my graph, I wouldn't be able to tell you that the answer is 16 that gives me 33. So you can't start with what we're trying to find. We have to plug in what we know. We know 33 tiles, we plug that in, and we work backwards to find the figure number. So this is 4Representations. This is what we're going to be working on using our y equals mx plus b, using our slope, using our table of values, using an equation to be able to answer questions. So now that you're done with these notes, this video is here for you to watch, so if you need to watch it again, feel free. Otherwise, you have an assignment that is the 4Representations worksheet. Get started on that and do a good job for the sub, and we will see you on Wednesday. Thanks, guys.